Hello everyone, in this video we are going to cover the complete NCERT class 11 physics syllabus. Let's take a look at each chapter and its section to get a clear picture of what you will be learning. So class 11 physics have two parts, part 1 and part 2. So let's start with part 1 and then we'll focus on the first chapter 1, which is units and measurements. In this chapter, we'll start with introduction, followed by the international system of units. Then we'll move on to the significant figures. Next, dimension of physical quantities. Then we'll focus on dimensional formulae and dimensional equations. And finally, we'll be learning dimensional analysis and its applications. So these are the topics that we'll be covering in chapter 1. So let's move on to chapter 2, which is motion in a straight line. And in this chapter, we'll start with introduction, followed by instantaneous velocity and speed. Then we'll move on to acceleration. Finally, we'll be focusing on kinematic equations for uniformly accelerated motion. So these are pretty much the topics that will be part of chapter 2. Let's move on to chapter 3, motion in a plane, where we will start with introduction, followed by scalars and vectors. And then we'll move on to multiplication of vectors by real numbers, then addition and subtraction of vectors, using graphical method. Then we'll focus on resolution of vectors, followed by vector addition, analytical method. Next, motion in a plane, followed by motion in a plane with constant acceleration. Then we'll move on to projectile motion, and finally, we'll be learning uniform circular motion. So these are the topics that will be covered in chapter 3. So let's move on to chapter 4, which is laws of motion. In this chapter, we'll start with introduction, followed by Aristotle's fallacy. Then we'll focus on the law of inertia, followed by Newton's first law of motion, then Newton's second law of motion, then Newton's third law of motion, followed by conservation of momentum, and then equilibrium of a particle, followed by common forces in mechanics, and then we'll move to circular motion, and finally we'll be learning solving problems in mechanics. So these are the topics that we'll be learning as part of chapter 4. Let's move on to chapter 5, which is work, energy, and power. And in this chapter, we'll start with introductions, then notions of work and kinetic energy, the work energy theorem, followed by work, then kinetic energy, followed by work done by a variable force, followed by the work energy theorem for a variable force, followed by the concept of potential energy, then the conservation of mechanical energy, followed by the potential energy of a spring, then power, and finally collisions. Okay, these are the topics that will be part of chapter 5. On to chapter 6, which is system of particles and rotational motion. And we'll start with the introduction, then we'll move on to center of mass, then motion of center of mass, then we'll followed by linear moment of a system of particles. Then we'll focus on vector product of two vectors, followed by angular velocity and its relation with linear velocity, then torque and angular momentum, followed by equilibrium of a rigid body. Then we'll move on towards moment of inertia, followed by kinematics of rotational motion about a fixed axis, then dynamics of rotational motion about a fixed axis, and finally the angular momentum in case of rotations about a fixed axis. So these are the topics that is part of chapter 6. Let's move on to chapter 7. So let's move on to chapter 7, which is gravitation. We'll start with the introduction, then Gauss's law. We'll move towards universal law of gravitation, then followed by gravitational constant, then acceleration due to gravity of the earth, followed by acceleration due to gravity below and above the surface of earth, and then followed by gravitational potential energy, escape seed, earth satellites, and finally the energy of an orbiting satellite. So these are the topics that is part of gravitation. So let's move on to chapter 8, which is part of part 2. So as I said earlier, so class 11 physics have two parts, part 1 and part 2. So we pretty much covered part 1, the different chapters and topics. Let's move on to part 2, and we'll start with chapter 8, which is mechanical properties of solids. And in this chapter, we'll start with induction, then stress and strain, followed by Hooke's law, and then we'll focus on focus strain curve, then elastic modeling, and finally we'll learn about applications of elastic behavior of materials. So these are the topics That's part of chapter 8. Then let's move on to chapter 9, which is mechanical properties of fluids. Where we'll start with introduction, followed by pressure, then streamline flow, followed by Bernoulli's principle. Then we'll move on to viscosity, and finally we'll focus on surface tension. So these are pretty much the topics that we'll be learning in chapter 9. Okay. So let's move on to chapter 10, which is thermal properties of matter. We'll start with the introduction, then we'll move on to temperature and heat, followed by measurement of temperatures, and then ideal gas equation at absolute temperature, and then we'll learn thermal expansion. We'll focus on specific heat capacity, followed by calorimetry, and then change of state, followed by heat transfer, and finally we'll learn Newton's law of cooling. So these are the topics that we'll focus on chapter 10. So now let's move on to chapter 11, which is thermodynamics. We'll start with the introduction, then we'll move towards thermal equilibrium, followed by zeroth law of thermodynamics, and then we'll move towards heat, internal energy, and work, followed by first law of thermodynamics, and then we'll learn specific heat capacity, followed by thermodynamics, state variables, and equation of state, and then we'll focus on thermodynamic processes, followed by second law of thermodynamics, and then reversible and irreversible process, and finally Carnot engine. So these are the topics that are part of chapter 11. So let's move on to chapter 12, which is kinetic theory. We'll start with introduction, molecular nature of matter, behavior of gases, kinetic theory of an ideal gas, then law of equipartition of energy, and we'll move towards specific heat capacity, followed by mean free path. So these are the topics that is part of chapter 12. Let's move on to chapter 13, which is oscillations. We'll start with introduction, and we'll move towards periodic and oscillatory motions, followed by simple harmonic motion, then simple harmonic motion and uniform circular motion, followed by velocity and acceleration in simple harmonic motion. Then we'll move towards force law for simple harmonic motion, followed by energy in simple harmonic motion, and finally we'll be learning the simple pendulum. So these are pretty much the topic for chapter 13. So let's move on to chapter 14, which is waves. We'll start with introduction, then we'll focus on transverse and longitudinal waves, followed by displacement relation in a progressive wave. Then we'll focus towards the speed of a traveling wave, followed by the principle of superposition of waves, then reflection of waves, and finally we will learn the topic beats. So these are pretty much the topics that belongs to chapter 14. So that's wrap up the entire thing. So as I said, we have two chapters, part 1 and part 2, which is a complete syllabus of NCERT for class 11 physics. Thanks for watching. And if you want to enroll in this course, please call us at the number shown in the screen. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.